The call came at dawn, a desperate rancher reporting a massive Brahman bull caught in the jaws of a giant caiman at the river's edge. Ranger Jake Thornton had seen plenty in his 15 years patrolling the Amazon basin, but something in the caller's voice made his stomach knot. "How long's it been going on?" Jake asked, already signaling his team. "Lord have mercy, must be 20 minutes now. Bull's still fighting, but there's blood everywhere." Jake checked his watch, 6:17 a.m. "We'll be there in 40 minutes. Don't approach them." "Better make it 30, the rancher said, voice breaking. "I don't think either of them's gonna last much longer." Jake grabbed his gear, a strange feeling settling over him. 30 minutes to reach them. Maybe another 30 to execute a rescue. 1 hour to save 2 lives or lose them both. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The ranger's truck barreled down the muddy road, tires spitting wet earth behind them as they raced toward the Lawson Ranch. Jake gripped the wheel with white knuckles, stealing glances at the dashboard clock. Beside him, Melissa Carter, the team's wildlife biologist, studied satellite images of the river bend on her tablet. "This doesn't make sense," she muttered, brushing a strand of blonde hair from her face. "Caimans rarely attack cattle this size unless they're desperate." In the back seat, Ryan Peterson checked his tranquilizer rifle for the 3rd time. "Desperate or not, we need a clean shot to sedate the caiman without hitting the bull." The truck crested a hill, revealing the sprawling Lawson Ranch below, 5,000 acres of pasture carved from the edge of the Amazon rainforest. A controversial operation run by Robert Lawson, an American who'd moved here 10 years ago against the advice of locals who warned the land was too close to the river. They spotted Lawson at the edge of his property, waving them down frantically. At 65, he was lean and weathered, his skin tanned deep brown from years under the Brazilian sun. "Thank God you're here," he said as they pulled up. His blue eyes were wild with worry. "It's Warrior, my prize bull. Best damn animal I've ever raised." Jake grabbed his field kit. "Show us." Lawson led them through a grove of trees to the riverbank. The sight that greeted them made even Jake, a veteran of wildlife emergencies, pause. In the shallow water, a silver-gray Brahman bull with a massive hump and powerful shoulders was locked in a deadly struggle with one of the largest black caimans Jake had ever seen. Nearly 14 feet of prehistoric power. The caiman had the bull's hind leg clamped in its jaws while the bull somehow maintained its footing, neither fleeing nor fully succumbing. "That's a Brahman bull worth $20,000, Lawson said, his voice cracking. "Raised him from a calf. Never seen an animal with such intelligence." What struck Jake wasn't just the size of the animals, but their condition. The bull's muscular frame showed multiple old scars, while the caiman appeared unnaturally thin, its ribs visible beneath scaled skin. "Something's off here," Melissa whispered, watching through binoculars. "The caiman's malnourished. And look at the bull. It's not panicking like it should be." Ryan readied his rifle. "What's the call, Jake? We're burning daylight." Jake studied the scene, years of experience telling him this was no ordinary animal encounter. The bull's eyes seemed too alert, too calculating for an animal supposedly fighting for its life. "Give me 5 minutes," he said. "There's more to this story." Robert Lawson had never planned on becoming a cattle rancher in Brazil. 10 years ago, he'd been a successful investment banker in Boston with a corner office overlooking the harbor. His life had followed a predictable trajectory. Dartmouth undergraduate, Harvard Business School, marriage to Catherine, his college sweetheart, and a career that provided everything money could buy, until the day it all shattered. "Warrior was part of my second chance," Robert explained as they watched the bulls struggle from a safe distance. His voice carried the distinctive Boston accent he'd never fully shed. "After Kate died, I couldn't bear to stay in that empty house. walking past her garden every morning, seeing her touch in every room. Jake nodded, recognizing the familiar shape of grief in the older man's words. It was a language he'd learned himself after losing his father to cancer 5 years earlier. Sold everything, cashed out my retirement, and bought this place sight unseen, Robert continued, his weathered hands gesturing toward the expanse of the ranch. Everyone thought I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had. The ranch had been little more than overgrown pasture when Robert arrived. 5,000 acres bordering the Amazon River, with a dilapidated farmhouse and a handful of scraggly cattle. The previous owner, a Brazilian farmer named Carlos Mendes, had struggled for decades against the encroaching jungle and the seasonal flooding that turned parts of the property into swampland. First year was hell, Robert admitted. Didn't speak the language, didn't know the first thing about raising cattle. The locals took bets on how long the crazy American would last. He smiled ruefully. The longest bet was 6 months. What had saved him, ironically, was his banker's pragmatism. Rather than fighting against the land's natural rhythms, Robert had studied them. He'd hired local workers who understood the region's ecological patterns and invested in raising Brahman cattle, a breed adapted to tropical climates with their distinctive humps and heat-resistant traits. Warrior came to me as a calf, Robert said, his voice softening at the memory. Part of my first real investment in quality breeding stock. Something about him stood out from the beginning. The calf had been smaller than the others, born to a mother who rejected him. Robert, still raw from his own losses, had bottle-fed the young bull himself, spending hours in the barn during those first crucial weeks. Used to read Kate's favorite books out loud while I fed him, Robert said with a self-conscious chuckle. Hemingway, mostly. Figured if I was going to be living this adventure, might as well have the literature to match. As Warrior grew, Robert noticed behaviors that differentiated him from the other cattle. The young bull watched everything with unusual intensity. He learned routines quickly, anticipating feeding times, recognizing specific workers, even seeming to understand basic commands. "I know how it sounds," Robert said, catching Melissa's skeptical glance. "I'm not claiming he's human, but there's something different about him. Ask any of my workers." By the bull's 3rd year, he'd grown into a magnificent specimen, nearly 2,000 pounds of muscle crowned with a prominent silver-gray hump. Robert had resisted using him exclusively for breeding, instead allowing Warrior to remain with the main herd, where he quickly established himself as a leader. That's when the problems with the local environmental authorities started, Robert explained. His relationship with the Regional Environmental Protection Agency had been contentious from the beginning. As an American landowner in a sensitive ecological area, he'd faced extra scrutiny, frequent inspections, and accusations of land misuse. "They claimed I was allowing my cattle too close to protected wetlands during the dry season," Robert said. "Wanted me to build expensive fencing systems that would have bankrupted me." Jake nodded, familiar with the ongoing tensions between ranchers and conservation efforts. It was a conflict he navigated daily in his work, balancing the needs of local livelihoods against environmental protection. 2 years ago, things came to a head, Robert continued. They threatened to revoke my permits over alleged habitat destruction near the river. That's when I noticed something strange about Warrior. During the height of the dispute, Robert had observed the bull repeatedly leading the herd away from the contested areas, almost as if he understood the boundaries that were causing such conflict. It had seemed impossible, but the pattern was too consistent to ignore. "Started watching him more carefully after that," Robert said. He developed this routine of checking the entire perimeter of wherever the herd was grazing, like a sentinel. 6 months ago, Robert had installed wildlife cameras around his property, partly to document his compliance with environmental regulations and partly out of growing fascination with Warrior's behavior. The footage had revealed patterns that defied conventional understanding of bovine intelligence. "He intervenes when younger animals stray too close to danger," Robert explained. Positions himself between the herd and predators, creates diversions when necessary. Pride crept into his voice. Never seen anything like it in 40 years around livestock. The most remarkable incident had occurred 3 months earlier, when a young calf had wandered into a muddy section of riverbank during the rainy season. Robert had watched through binoculars as Warrior deliberately created a disturbance on the opposite side of the herd, drawing the attention of the other cattle and the mother cow, effectively herding them away from the danger zone and toward the stranded calf. After Kate died, the grief counselor told me I needed to find purpose again, Robert said quietly. Said I needed something to care for, something that needed me back. He looked toward the river where Warrior continued his strange standoff with the Caiman. Never expected it would be a bull. Melissa had been listening intently, her scientific skepticism gradually giving way to professional curiosity. Has he interacted with Caimans before today? She asked. Robert hesitated, and Jake detected a flicker of something, guilt perhaps, cross the older man's face. This isn't the first time, Robert admitted. I've seen him near this same section of river multiple times in the past few weeks. Always at dawn, always alone. He paused. I thought he was just claiming territory, showing dominance. Bulls do that. Ryan, who had been scanning the riverbank with binoculars, suddenly lowered them and turned to Robert. These calves that Warrior protects, where are they now? Robert frowned. Should be with the main herd, up in the north pasture. Why? Because I think I just spotted movement in the brush about 200 yards downriver, Ryan replied. Looks like cattle, but smaller. Could be calves. Jake felt the first piece of the puzzle click into place. Mr. Lawson, do you have any way to get a better view of the river? Drone, maybe? Robert nodded slowly. Got a drone last month. Been using it to check fences and monitor the herd. He hesitated again. There's something else you should know. They all turned to him, waiting. That Caiman, I think it's the same one that's been in this section of river for years. Locals call it Velho, the old one. It's been here longer than I have. Robert's voice dropped. And I've seen Warrior interact with it before. Not fighting exactly, but I don't know how to describe it. Jake and Melissa exchanged glances. The picture forming was unlike anything in their experience. We need to see that drone footage, Jake said. Both today's situation and any past interactions you've recorded. As they turned to head back to the ranch house, Jake cast one more glance toward the river. The massive bull and ancient Caiman remained locked in their strange dance, predator and prey engaged in what was beginning to seem less like a deadly encounter and more like a carefully choreographed ritual. For the first time in his career, Jake wondered if he was witnessing not just animal behavior, but animal communication, a language of survival developed between species that humans had always assumed were incapable of such complexity. And if that were true, the clock wasn't just ticking on a rescue mission. It was counting down to a fundamental reconsideration of what they thought they knew about the natural world. Inside Robert's ranch house, the team gathered around a laptop on the kitchen table. The walls were adorned with cattle breeding awards and faded photographs, remnants of Robert's decade in Brazil, interspersed with a few precious images from his previous life. A wedding photo showed a younger Robert beside a smiling woman with kind eyes and chestnut hair, Catherine. Drone's fully charged, Robert said, typing commands into the laptop. I can have it airborne in 2 minutes. Jake paced by the window, keeping an eye on the river scene. We need to move quickly. That bull's losing blood, and if the Caiman decides to death roll... No one needed him to finish the sentence. The Caiman's signature attack, grabbing prey and spinning violently to tear off chunks of flesh, would be devastating to even an animal as large as Warrior. I still don't understand why neither animal is behaving typically, Melissa said, reviewing her notes. A predator that size should have either succeeded or given up by now, and prey animals don't usually maintain such controlled responses during attacks. Ryan checked his watch. 28 minutes since we arrived. The bull's been in those jaws for almost an hour total. Robert finished his preparations and stood. Drones ready. I'll launch from the back porch for better signal. They followed him outside, where the morning humidity hung heavy in the air. Robert operated the controls with surprising dexterity for a man his age, sending the small quadcopter rising above the tree line. "I'll do a sweep of the immediate area first," he said, eyes fixed on the tablet displaying the drone's camera feed. "Then we can check downstream where Ryan spotted movement." The aerial view revealed the full tableau of the strange confrontation. From above, the massive silver-gray bull stood in water reaching halfway up his legs. The caiman's dark form stretched alongside him, jaws clamped on the bull's hind leg. But what struck Jake immediately was the positioning. The bull wasn't trying to flee toward the shore. Instead, he stood at an angle that kept the caiman in the water. "Can you pan right?" Jake asked, pointing to the tablet. "Let's see what's downstream." Robert adjusted the controls, and the drone's camera shifted. About 200 yards downriver, partially hidden by overhanging vegetation, a small group of cattle had gathered at the water's edge. "Those are calves," Melissa confirmed, studying the footage. "Look at their size and coloring, probably 4 to 6 months old." "What in tarnation are they doing separated from the main herd?" Robert muttered. "They should be up in the north pasture with their mothers." Ryan zoomed in using the tablet controls. 6 of them. They're drinking at the river's edge. Jake studied the geography visible in the drone footage. "Notice anything unusual about that spot where the calves are?" Melissa leaned closer. "The river makes a sharp bend there, creating a shallow pool. And look at the far bank. It's steep, almost vertical." "No access point for predators," Jake concluded. "A caiman couldn't easily approach from the opposite shore." Robert's eyes widened with sudden understanding. "And Warrior and the caiman are positioned at the only logical approach path from this side of the river." A theory was forming in Jake's mind, one so incredible he hesitated to voice it. But Melissa, with her scientific training, was already connecting the same dots. "We need to see previous footage," she said urgently. "If this is what I think it is." Robert nodded, hands trembling slightly as he switched from the live drone feed to saved videos on the laptop. "I've been recording wildlife activity for months. Let me pull up footage from the last few weeks." The first video, dated 10 days earlier, showed a nearly identical scene. Warrior standing in the same spot in the river, the caiman nearby. But in this footage, the encounter appeared less violent. The caiman approached the bull, who stood his ground. After what seemed like a standoff, the bull turned and moved away, leaving something behind in the water. "What did he drop?" Jake asked, squinting at the grainy footage. Robert rewound and zoomed in. "Looks like vegetation? Maybe river plants?" Melissa shook her head. "Not plants. That's regurgitated cud. Partially digested grass from the bull's first stomach." Ryan looked disgusted. "The bull is feeding the caiman its own puke?" "Cud is highly nutritious," Melissa explained. "Rich in proteins and partially broken down for easier digestion. For a starving predator, it would be better than nothing," Jake finished. They watched 3 more videos, each showing variations of the same pattern. Warrior would appear at the river at dawn, sometimes with the calves nearby in their protected alcove. The caiman would approach. There would be a brief physical interaction, sometimes appearing aggressive, sometimes more ritualized. And then the bull would leave something in the water for the caiman. "Well, I'll be damned," Robert whispered, his Boston accent thickening with emotion. "He's been protecting those calves by feeding the caiman, creating a distraction and providing an alternative food source." Jake turned to the window, recalculating the situation entirely. But today is different. The Caiman has actually bitten him, and it's not letting go. Ryan was already moving toward the door. Something's changed in the dynamic. We need to get back out there. As they hurried back toward the river, Jake's mind raced through possibilities. Melissa, why would the Caiman escalate to actually attacking the bull after weeks of this arrangement? She kept pace beside him, thinking aloud. Increased hunger, territorial dispute, or... She stopped abruptly. Or it's not an attack at all. What do you mean? The Caiman could be starving to death, she explained. Look how emaciated it is. The cud might not be enough anymore. It might be literally holding on to its only reliable food source. When they reached the riverbank, the situation appeared unchanged. The massive bull standing stoically in the water, the Caiman still gripping its hind leg. But now they observed with new understanding. Look at the bull's eyes, Melissa said quietly. That's not panic or aggression. That's tolerance. Jake made a decision. Ryan, prepare a mild sedative for the Caiman, just enough to make it release its grip without causing respiratory distress. Mr. Lawson, can your drone drop small payloads? Robert nodded. Nothing heavy, but a syringe would work. Good. We'll use the drone to deliver the sedative, safer than risking anyone in the water. Jake turned to Melissa. Once the Caiman releases the bull, we'll need to treat that leg wound immediately. And then what? Robert asked, his voice tight with concern. This isn't a one-time problem that'll go away with a bandage. Jake took a deep breath. Then we figure out a long-term solution that works for all parties involved. If what we're seeing is real, if these animals have actually developed this kind of relationship, we might be witnessing something unprecedented. As Ryan prepared the sedative, Jake watched the bull standing in the river. Warrior's massive head turned slightly, his dark eye seeming to track their movements on shore. Despite the weight of scientific training telling him not to anthropomorphize, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the animal was aware. Not just of pain or danger, but of purpose. The clock was still ticking. The bull had lost blood. The Caiman was starving, but the nature of the emergency had transformed. They weren't just racing to save animals from a deadly encounter. They were racing to preserve something far more rare and valuable, a demonstration of adaptation and cooperation across species that defied everything Jake thought he knew about the natural world. And for the first time in his career, Jake wasn't sure if human intervention was the answer or the problem. Ryan worked quickly, preparing a measured dose of ketamine, enough to temporarily sedate the Caiman without endangering it. This should take effect within minutes of injection, he explained, securing the syringe to a lightweight delivery mechanism that could be attached to the drone. But Robert had gone silent, staring at his tablet with an expression of pure astonishment. You all need to see this, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. They gathered around the screen, where Robert had pulled up footage from his property's security cameras. The timestamp showed 4:38 a.m., nearly 2 hours before his desperate call to the Rangers. The night vision recording showed Warrior leading a small group of calves toward the river in the pre-dawn darkness. The bull moved with purpose, occasionally stopping to ensure the younger animals were following. When they reached the bend in the river, the protected alcove they'd spotted on the drone, Warrior positioned himself at the entry point while the calves began to drink. He deliberately brought them here, Melissa said, her scientific skepticism crumbling before the undeniable evidence. This isn't random behavior. The footage continued. After the calves had drunk their fill, Warrior herded them a safe distance from the water. Then, remarkably, the bull returned to the river alone. He entered the water at precisely the spot where they'd found him, grappled with the Caiman. Wait for it, Robert said softly. Moments later, the Caiman appeared, gliding through the water toward the bull. In the grainy night vision footage, they could see Warrior lower his head, presenting his horns as if in greeting or challenge. The Caiman circled once, then approached. What happened next defied all conventional understanding of predator-prey dynamics. The bull deliberately turned, offering his hind leg to the Caiman. The predator opened its massive jaws and clamped down, not in the violent snap of a killing bite, but in what almost appeared to be a measured grasp. Warrior didn't panic or flee. He stood firm as the Caiman maintained its hold. "Sweet Lord above," Robert breathed. "He's letting it happen." Jake felt the hairs rise on the back of his neck. This changes everything. Melissa's scientific mind was racing to make sense of what they were witnessing. It's like a controlled feeding ritual. The bull is allowing the Caiman to take small amounts of blood or tissue, providing protein the predator desperately needs. "But why?" Ryan asked, still adjusting the sedative dose. "Why would any animal deliberately allow itself to be injured?" "To protect the young," Melissa answered. "By satisfying the Caiman's hunger in a controlled way, Warrior ensures it won't target the calves." Robert's weathered face showed a mixture of pride and concern. "But today something's different. The Caiman isn't letting go like it usually does." Jake studied the live drone footage, where the standoff continued. The Caiman looks even more emaciated than in previous recordings. It might be too weak to hunt normally, too desperate to follow whatever protocol they've established. "We're witnessing an ecosystem in crisis," Melissa said. "This relationship they've developed, as extraordinary as it is, isn't sustainable. The Caiman needs more nutrition than it can safely take from the bull without causing permanent damage." Ryan held up the prepared syringe. "So what's the call? Do we intervene or not?" Jake faced the hardest decision of his career. Interfering with wildlife was always a balancing act between compassion and respect for natural processes. But this situation defied all categories. "If we do nothing, both animals could die," he said, thinking aloud. "The bull from blood loss or infection, the Caiman from starvation. But if we intervene without understanding the full dynamic, we might make things worse," Melissa countered. Robert had been silent, studying the footage with intense concentration. Now he looked up, his blue eyes clear with sudden understanding. "The calves," he said. "Look at the calves in the footage. They're not his." Everyone turned to him in confusion. "Warrior is a bull, not a cow." "Those can't be his biological offspring," Robert explained. "And I recognize their markings. They're from Carlos Mendez's abandoned property that borders mine to the south." "The ranch that went bankrupt last year?" Jake asked. Robert nodded. "Carlos left behind some cattle when the bank foreclosed. Most were rounded up, but these calves must have been born after that, from pregnant cows that escaped the roundup." "They've been feral for months." Melissa's eyes widened with realization. "And Warrior adopted them." "These ain't just any calves," Robert said, a tremor in his voice. "They're orphans. No mothers, no herd protection. They would have been easy prey for any predator." Jake felt a profound shift in his understanding as the final piece clicked into place. So Warrior didn't just develop a feeding arrangement with the Caiman to protect his own herd. He specifically took responsibility for the most vulnerable animals that had no other protection. The implications were staggering. It suggested levels of empathy, altruism, and problem-solving that went far beyond conventional understanding of bovine cognition. "Look at today's timing," Melissa said, reviewing the footage again. "The ritual went wrong after the calves left. See how the Caiman doesn't release its grip? I think it's too weak to hunt normally anymore. It's holding on because it's literally starving to death." Jake made his decision. "We need to separate them safely and then create a sustainable solution. These animals have developed something remarkable, and we have a responsibility to preserve it if we can." Ryan attached the syringe to the drone, and Robert took control, maneuvering the small aircraft over the river. With precision born of practice, he positioned the drone directly above the Caiman and deployed the syringe, which plunged into the predator's tough hide just behind its skull. "Perfect shot," Ryan said. "Now we wait." For several tense minutes, nothing changed. Then, gradually, the Caiman's grip on Warrior's leg began to loosen. The massive reptile didn't fully lose consciousness. The dose was too carefully measured for that, but its jaws relaxed enough for the bull to pull free. What happened next astonished them all. Instead of immediately retreating to shore, Warrior stood his ground for a moment, regarding the now subdued Caiman. Then, deliberately, he lowered his head to the water and regurgitated a substantial amount of cud before slowly backing away. "He's still feeding it," Melissa whispered, "even after being injured." As the bull finally turned toward shore, Jake saw the full extent of the damage to its hind leg. Multiple puncture wounds, some quite deep, with blood staining the water around them. "We need to treat those wounds immediately," he said. "Mr. Lawson, can you get Warrior into a handling facility?" Robert shook his head, watching as the massive bull limped toward them. "Won't need to. Not with him." To Jake's amazement, Warrior approached them directly, stopping just a few yards away. The bull's dark eyes held an intelligence that seemed to transcend species barriers. He was in pain. That much was clear from his labored breathing and the way he favored his injured leg, but he showed no fear of the humans. "I've never seen anything like this," Ryan murmured, veterinary kit in hand. "Move slowly," Robert advised. "He trusts me, but he's still a 2,000-pound animal in pain." Robert approached Warrior first, speaking in low, soothing tones. "Easy, boy. We're going to help you out now. You did good. Real good." The bull remained still as Robert gently stroked his massive neck. After a moment he nodded to Ryan, who approached cautiously with antiseptic and antibiotics. While they treated Warrior's wounds, Jake and Melissa monitored the Caiman, which had drifted to a shallow part of the river where it was consuming the cud Warrior had left behind. "This arrangement can't continue," Melissa said quietly. "The Caiman needs proper nutrition, and Warrior can't keep sacrificing himself." Jake nodded, already formulating a plan. "We need a 3-part solution: a protected water access point for the calves, rehabilitation for the Caiman, and treatment for Warrior." As they discussed options, Jake noticed Robert's expression, a mixture of awe and something deeper, more personal. "You know," the older man said, watching as Ryan bandaged Warrior's leg, "when Catherine died, I thought I'd never see true selflessness again. She was a hospice nurse, spent her whole life caring for others, right up until cancer took her. I came here thinking I was running away from memories, but maybe," he gestured toward Warrior, "maybe I was meant to witness this. A reminder that giving of yourself for others isn't just a human quality." The revelation of Warrior's extraordinary behavior had transformed what began as an emergency rescue into something far more profound, a window into the complex emotional and cognitive lives of animals typically viewed as simple livestock or fearsome predators. Jake checked his watch. Just over an hour had passed since they'd arrived at the ranch. The immediate crisis had been averted, but the deeper challenge remained: how to honor and preserve the remarkable relationship they'd discovered while ensuring the welfare of all animals involved. As Warrior limped back toward the main pasture, occasionally looking back toward the river where the Caiman rested, Jake knew they weren't just witnesses to an unusual animal behavior. They were custodians of a story that could change how humans understood their place in the natural world, not as masters of creation, but as fellow travelers only beginning to comprehend the depth and complexity of other minds sharing the planet. With Warrior's wounds treated and the Caiman stabilized, the team gathered on Robert's covered porch to develop a long-term solution. The afternoon heat had intensified and thunder rumbled in the distance, a typical Amazon basin storm brewing on the horizon. The most immediate concern is keeping Warrior's wounds from getting infected, Ryan said, wiping sweat from his brow. I've administered antibiotics and anti-inflammatories, but he'll need follow-up treatment. Jake nodded, then turned to Robert. Tell us more about these orphaned calves. Have you noticed Warrior's protective behavior before today? Robert settled into a weathered rocking chair, his movements betraying the fatigue of a man who'd witnessed something that had shaken his worldview. Started noticing changes about 3 months ago, he said, gazing toward the pasture where Warrior had rejoined the small group of calves. At first I thought he was just establishing dominance, normal bull behavior. But then I saw patterns that didn't fit. 3 months earlier, Robert guided his ATV along the southern fence line, checking for breaks after the heavy spring rains. The wet season had been particularly harsh, turning portions of his property into virtual swampland and causing several fence sections to collapse under the weight of debris carried by flash floods. As he rounded a bend near the property line shared with the now abandoned Mendez Ranch, something caught his eye. Movement in a small clearing beyond his fence. He cut the engine and raised his binoculars. What he saw was unusual enough to make him doubt his eyes. Warrior, his prized Brahman bull, was herding a small group of calves that weren't from Robert's stock. The distinctive coloring and markings identified them as Mendez cattle, presumably born wild after the bank had repossessed the property and removed most of the herd. More remarkable than their presence was Warrior's behavior. The massive bull moved with surprising gentleness, positioning himself between the calves and a section of treacherous, muddy ground. When one of the younger calves strayed toward the hazard, Warrior nudged it back with careful precision. "That's the damnedest thing," Robert muttered to himself. He watched for nearly an hour as Warrior guided the small group to safe grazing areas, standing guard while they fed. It contradicted everything Robert thought he knew about bull behavior. Bulls didn't typically concern themselves with calves, especially those not from their own bloodline. That evening, Robert called Miguel, his most experienced ranch hand. "Have you ever seen a bull adopt calves?" he asked, after describing what he'd witnessed. There was a long pause on the line before Miguel answered. "My grandfather used to tell stories about special animals with alma vieja, an old soul. But I've never seen it myself." "What did these stories say about such animals?" "That they remember more than others, that they understand things beyond their nature." Miguel's voice held a note of reverence. "My grandfather would say God sometimes places a human soul in an animal body to teach us humility." Robert had dismissed it as folklore, the kind of mystical thinking that pervaded rural communities throughout Latin America. But over the following weeks he found himself observing Warrior with increasing fascination. "I started documenting his behavior," Robert told the rangers, pulling out a worn notebook from his back pocket. "At first I thought I was just seeing what I wanted to see, projecting human qualities onto animal behavior." He flipped through pages of handwritten observations, dates, times, and detailed notes about Warrior's interactions with the orphaned calves. But the evidence became too consistent to ignore. Jake leaned forward. "When did the Caiman enter the picture?" Robert turned to a section marked with a red tab. "First interaction I witnessed was about 6 weeks ago. Initially, I thought it was a normal predator-prey encounter." 6 weeks earlier, dawn was just breaking when Robert's security system alerted him to movement near the river. Grabbing his rifle, Caiman attacks on cattle were rare but not unheard of, he hurried toward the water's edge. The scene that greeted him was straight from a nature documentary. Warrior stood at the river's edge, his massive frame silhouetted against the pink-orange sunrise. In the water before him, the distinctive ridged back of a large caiman broke the surface. Robert raised his rifle, prepared to fire if the predator attacked. But what unfolded instead defied explanation. Warrior pawed at the ground, then lowered his head in what appeared to be a display of dominance. The Caiman responded by submerging briefly, then resurfacing closer to shore. There was a tense moment when Robert was certain he would need to shoot, but then something extraordinary happened. Warrior turned slightly sideways and regurgitated a portion of cud into the water. The Caiman moved forward, consuming the offering. After this exchange, the predator retreated into deeper water, and Warrior watched it go before turning back toward the pasture. Robert lowered his rifle, struggling to process what he'd witnessed. Later that same day, he observed Warrior leading the orphaned calves to a different section of the river, a secluded bend where the opposite bank rose in a steep cliff, preventing approach from that direction. The bull stood guard while the calves drank, his attention fixed on the water where the Caiman had appeared earlier. "It can't be what it looks like," Robert told himself. "Animals don't make deals." But over the following weeks, he witnessed variations of the same scenario multiple times. Warrior would bring the calves to the protected bend early in the morning, stand guard while they drank, then later approach the Caiman's territory alone. Sometimes he would leave cud. Other times, in a development that deeply troubled Robert, he would allow the Caiman to grasp his leg briefly before pulling away. Robert had considered reporting what he was seeing but feared the reaction. Who would believe him? What would the environmental authorities make of such a claim? Would they see it as evidence of a disturbed ecosystem requiring intervention that might separate Warrior from the calves he had taken under his protection? So he had kept silent, watching and documenting, torn between amazement at what he was witnessing and concern for Warrior's increasing self-sacrifice. "I should have called you sooner," Robert admitted, closing his notebook. "This morning was different. The Caiman wouldn't let go." I panicked. Melissa had been reviewing the footage on Robert's laptop while he spoke. "The progression is clear in the recordings," she said. "The Caiman has been getting weaker, more desperate. Today's encounter wasn't an escalation of aggression. It was an escalation of need." "This drought has been the worst in decades," Jake added. "Fish populations are down, natural prey is scarce. That Caiman is likely starving." Ryan, who had been relatively quiet, suddenly straightened in his chair. "The timing of all this, it corresponds with the abandonment of the Mendez property, right?" Robert nodded. "Carlos left about 8 months ago. These calves would have been born to cows already pregnant at the time of the bank foreclosure. And the increase in Caiman aggression coincides with the drought intensifying over the past month," Melissa added. Jake saw the connections forming. "So we have 3 simultaneous crises: orphaned calves with no protection, a starving apex predator, and a severe drought affecting the entire ecosystem. And one bull who somehow figured out how to address all 3, Robert said softly. The implications hung in the air between them. If what they were witnessing was real, if Warrior had genuinely developed a strategy to protect vulnerable calves by establishing a feeding relationship with a predator, it represented a level of problem-solving and altruism that defied conventional understanding of animal cognition. Ryan checked his watch. "The sedative will be wearing off the Caiman soon. We need a plan." Jake stood, decision made. "We need 3 things: a permanent safe water access point for the calves, a rehabilitation program for the Caiman, and ongoing medical care for Warrior." They spent the next hour developing a detailed plan. Robert would construct a protected watering station, essentially a small reservoir fed by the river but separated by strong fencing that would keep predators out while allowing cattle-safe access. The rangers would establish a feeding program for the Caiman, gradually rehabilitating it with appropriate nutrition until it could hunt naturally again. As for Warrior, his wounds would require regular treatment, and Robert agreed to bring the orphaned calves fully into his herd, providing them the protection of numbers they had lacked. "There's one more thing," Jake said as they finalized the details. This needs to be documented properly. What we've witnessed here isn't just an interesting anecdote, it's potentially groundbreaking for our understanding of animal cognition and interspecies relationships. Melissa nodded enthusiastically. I have colleagues at the university in Manaus who specialize in animal behavior research. With your permission, Mr. Lawson, they could set up proper observation protocols, gather data. Robert looked uncertain. I don't want this turning into some kind of circus. Warrior isn't a lab rat to be studied. Not a circus, Jake assured him. But think about what this could mean for conservation, for our understanding of the animals we share this planet with. If other ranchers understood cattle the way you've come to understand Warrior. The older man gazed out toward the pasture, where Warrior stood beneath a tree, the orphaned calves gathered around him. After a long moment, he nodded. All right, but on my terms. The animal's welfare comes first. As they finalized their plans, the skies opened up, releasing the threatened afternoon downpour. The sudden drumming of rain on the metal roof created a momentary pause in the conversation, a natural punctuation mark to the extraordinary day. Robert broke the silence. You know, when I was a banker, I thought I understood what made the world tick. Money, self-interest, competition, the invisible hand and all that. He gestured toward the rain-soaked pasture. Then I come here and witness a bull sacrificing his own safety for calves that aren't even his own, developing what amounts to a diplomatic relationship with a natural predator. He shook his head in wonder. Makes you wonder what else we've been missing all these years. Jake couldn't help but agree. His 15 years as a ranger had taught him respect for the complexity of natural systems, but today had shattered even his expanded conception of what animals were capable of. As the afternoon progressed, they put their plan into action. Ryan prepared additional treatments for Warrior's wounds. Melissa established the first feeding station for the Caiman, using fish locally sourced from fishermen upriver. Robert began sketching designs for the protected watering station. Jake found himself drawn back to the river's edge, where the Caiman had retreated to a half-submerged log after consuming the meal they'd provided. The ancient reptile, perhaps 20 years old by Melissa's estimation, watched him with eyes that had witnessed the river's changes through decades of human encroachment. He was struck by the realization that this creature, typically viewed as a mindless predator, a living fossil unchanged for millions of years, had adapted to changing circumstances with surprising flexibility. It had entered into a relationship of mutual benefit with a natural prey animal, modifying its hunting behavior to secure regular nutrition during a crisis. If a Caiman could adapt in this way, what did it say about the rigid categories humans imposed on the natural world? Predator and prey, wild and domestic, instinct and intelligence. The lines between these concepts suddenly seemed as fluid as the river itself. The rain eased as sunset approached. In the golden light of evening, Jake watched as Warrior led his adopted family across the pasture toward the main barn. The bull's gait was stiff from his injury, but his posture remained vigilant, protective. Tomorrow would bring the hard work of implementing their solutions, building the watering station, establishing the Caiman feeding program, treating Warrior's wounds. But for now, Jake allowed himself to simply witness the continuation of a relationship that had evolved without human design or intervention, a testament to the adaptability and intelligence of creatures humans too often underestimated. As darkness fell over the Amazon basin, the boundaries between species, between wildness and domestication, between instinct and cognition, seemed as indistinct as the line between river and shore. Not a sharp division, but a permeable frontier where unexpected connections could flourish if given the chance. By early morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a freshly washed landscape and air heavy with humidity. Jake stood at the edge of Robert's property, watching the sun rise over the Amazon basin. Behind him, the The ranger truck was loaded with supplies for the day's work: building materials for the protected watering station, medical equipment for Warrior, and the first components of a structured feeding program for the Caiman. Ryan approached, carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee. Robert says Warrior made it through the night without complications. Antibiotics seem to be working. Jake accepted the coffee gratefully. And the Caiman? Still in the same area of the river. Melissa's monitoring it with the drone. Ryan hesitated. But we've got a situation developing. Jake felt his muscles tense. What kind of situation? Regional environmental enforcement is on their way. Apparently, someone reported a wildlife incident at the Lawson Ranch. Ryan's expression was grim. Could be coincidence, but Robert mentioned past conflicts with the authorities, Jake finished. He checked his watch. How long do we have? 2 hours? Maybe less? Jake took a long drink of his coffee, considering their options. The arrival of environmental enforcement officers complicated matters significantly. While Jake's ranger unit had limited authority to intervene in wildlife emergencies, any long-term solution would require official approval. If the environmental agency deemed their plan inappropriate or, worse, decided the Caiman should be relocated and the bull put down due to his injuries. We need to move quickly, Jake decided. Let's get as much in place as possible before they arrive, and we need to document everything. All the evidence of Warrior's behavior, the relationship with the Caiman, everything. As they walked back to the main house, Jake's mind raced through potential scenarios. The scientific significance of what they'd discovered couldn't be overstated, but bureaucracy rarely made room for exceptions, even exceptional ones. Inside, they found Robert and Melissa gathered around the kitchen table reviewing the construction plans for the watering station. "Environmental officers are on their way," Jake announced without preamble. Robert's weathered face darkened. "Marcos Torres and his team, I'd bet my last dollar. Been trying to find reasons to fine me or shut me down for years." "Then we need to be ready," Jake said. "Mr. Lawson, you have legal rights as a property owner, but this situation involves protected wildlife, which falls under their jurisdiction." Melissa looked up from the plans. "We need to approach this scientifically. If we present this as an unprecedented case of interspecies cooperation worthy of study rather than intervention." "Torres won't care," Robert interrupted. "He sees ranchers as the enemy, plain and simple." Jake understood the tension. Throughout the Amazon basin, the relationship between environmental protection agencies and landowners was often antagonistic. Decades of illegal deforestation and habitat destruction had created deep mistrust on both sides. "Then we make him care," Jake said firmly. "We show him what's at stake here isn't just one bull and one Caiman, but our understanding of animal cognition and behavior." They quickly divided responsibilities. Melissa would organize all their observational data and footage. Ryan would continue monitoring both animals' health. Jake would start construction on the watering station to demonstrate their commitment to a sustainable solution. Robert would prepare to meet with the environmental officers. As Jake and Ryan unloaded building materials near the river bend, they could see Warrior in the distance, limping but still mobile, keeping watch over the orphaned calves as they grazed in the morning sun. "What do you think drives him?" Ryan asked, watching the bull's protective movements. "It's not just instinct. Those aren't his calves." Jake considered the question as he measured and marked the fence line for the protected watering access. "I've seen unusual adoptions in the wild before, lionesses adopting orphaned cubs, even cross-species fostering. But this level of problem-solving, this ability to negotiate with a predator," he shook his head. "This is something different." They worked steadily for the next hour, digging post holes and setting the first supports for the fence that would create a safe corridor to the water. The design would allow cattle access while preventing approach from Caiman-accessible areas. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it would demonstrate their intentions to the environmental officers. Melissa joined them, carrying her tablet. I've compiled all the footage and organized it chronologically. It tells a compelling story. Will it be enough? Ryan asked. Before Melissa could answer, they heard the sound of vehicles approaching. They're early, Jake muttered, wiping sweat from his forehead. Two white trucks bearing the logo of the Brazilian Environmental Protection Agency pulled into view. 4 officers emerged, led by a stern-faced man in his 50s, whom Jake assumed must be Marcos Torres. Robert walked down from the house to meet them, his posture rigid with barely concealed tension. Jake, Melissa, and Ryan exchanged glances, then moved to join the confrontation, carrying their documentation and prepared to present their case. As they approached, they could hear Torres speaking in accented but fluent English. Mr. Lawson, we received reports of illegal wildlife interaction on your property, specifically allegations that you are allowing your cattle to enter protected wetland areas and that there has been a Caiman attack. Robert's face remained impassive. There has been an incident, yes, but not what you're thinking. Torres's expression suggested skepticism. We will need to inspect the area and assess the situation, if protected species have been harmed or if regulations have been violated. With all due respect, Jake interrupted, stepping forward and presenting his ranger identification. I'm Jake Thornton, Senior Ranger with the Rio Negro Conservation Unit. My team has been on site since yesterday managing what has turned out to be an extraordinary wildlife situation. Torres turned his attention to Jake, his demeanor cooling slightly in recognition of a fellow professional. Ranger Thornton, your jurisdiction doesn't typically extend to private ranch land. We responded to an emergency call, Jake explained. But what we discovered merits scientific documentation rather than enforcement action. Melissa stepped forward with her tablet. Dr. Melissa Carter, wildlife biologist. We've documented something unprecedented, a case of interspecies cooperation that challenges our understanding of animal cognition. Torres's expression remained skeptical, but Jake could see a flicker of professional curiosity in the man's eyes. Show me. For the next 20 minutes, they presented their evidence, the security footage, the drone recordings, Robert's detailed notes, and their own observations. Torres and his team watched in increasingly stunned silence as the relationship between Warrior and the Caiman unfolded before them. When the presentation concluded, Torres removed his hat, wiping his brow. In 30 years of environmental work, I have never... He trailed off, then turned to Robert. Mr. Lawson, you understand that if I had received this information without visual evidence, I would have dismissed it as impossible. Robert nodded. That's why I didn't report it earlier. Who would believe me? Torres walked to the edge of the property, gazing toward the river where the Caiman remained and the pasture where Warrior stood with his adopted calves. For a long moment he was silent, seemingly wrestling with protocol versus the extraordinary situation before him. Finally he turned back. Protocol dictates that I should order the relocation of the Caiman to prevent further cattle injuries. It also suggests that a bull with wounds like those described should be evaluated for humane euthanasia. Jake felt his heart sink. This was exactly what they had feared. However, Torres continued, there are provisions in our regulations for exceptions in cases of scientific significance. He gestured to the tablet, still displaying footage of Warrior's remarkable behavior. This qualifies. Relief washed over Jake. So you'll allow us to implement our management plan? Under supervision, Torres clarified. My team will need to approve the specifics, and we will require regular reports. He turned to Melissa. Dr. Carter, would you be willing to serve as the scientific lead on documenting this case for peer review? Melissa nodded eagerly. Absolutely. I've already contacted colleagues at the university who specialize in animal cognition research. For the first time, Torres allowed a small smile. "Then let us see this bull and Caiman for ourselves, and we can discuss the details of your proposed management plan." As the expanded group made their way toward the river, Jake felt the weight of the past 24 hours settle on his shoulders. They had averted one crisis only to face another, but now, with official support, their chances of creating a sustainable solution had improved dramatically. At the river's edge, they spotted the Caiman sunning itself on a partially submerged log. Despite the sedative having long worn off, the reptile remained in the area, a testament to the relationship it had established with this particular location and presumably with Warrior. "It's severely undernourished," Torres observed, studying the Caiman through binoculars. "The drought has hit the aquatic ecosystems particularly hard this year." "Our feeding program will address that," Melissa explained, "gradually increasing nutrition until it can hunt naturally again." Torres nodded his approval, then turned his attention to the pasture where Warrior stood watching them, the orphaned calves clustered behind him as if seeking protection. "And the bull?" Those wounds looked significant. Ryan stepped forward. "I've administered antibiotics and anti-inflammatories. The punctures are deep but clean. With continued treatment, he should recover fully." As if understanding he was the subject of their discussion, Warrior began to move toward them, his gait stiff but determined. The calves followed at a distance, unwilling to be separated from their protector, but wary of the gathered humans. "Remarkable," Torres murmured. "It's approaching intentionally." Robert moved ahead of the group. "He knows me. Let me talk to him first." Jake watched as the rancher approached his bull, speaking in low, soothing tones. Warrior stopped a few yards away, his massive head lowered slightly, dark eyes fixed on Robert with what Jake could only describe as recognition. "It's okay, boy," Robert said, his voice carrying on the morning air. "These folks are here to help." "To understand what you've been doing." To everyone's amazement, Warrior took another step forward, then turned his head toward the river, where the Caiman rested as if acknowledging the connection they were discussing. The moment held a power that transcended scientific analysis or regulatory concerns. Even Torres, with his decades of environmental enforcement experience, seemed momentarily overcome by the simple dignity of the animal before them. "We have underestimated them," the officer said quietly. "Perhaps we have underestimated all of them." The next few hours were consumed with detailed planning. Torres and his team worked with Jake, Melissa, and Ryan to refine the management strategy. The watering station construction continued, now with additional manpower from the Environmental Agency. A formal feeding program for the Caiman was established, with precise nutritional guidelines and a tapering schedule designed to rehabilitate the reptile without creating dependency. By mid-afternoon, as the Amazon heat reached its peak, the framework of their solution was taking shape, not just physically in the form of the watering station, but conceptually as a model for how humans might better understand and respect the complex relationships in the natural world. As the work continued, Jake found himself standing alone with Robert, watching as Warrior led the calves to a shady area beneath a spreading tree. "You know," Robert said, breaking a comfortable silence, "when my wife was dying, she told me something I didn't understand at the time. She said, 'Bobby, when I'm gone, look for the lessons in unexpected places.' I thought it was just the morphine talking." He gestured toward Warrior. "Now I wonder if she knew something I didn't." Jake nodded, understanding the sentiment. "The natural world is full of lessons if we're humble enough to see them. 15 years ago, I would have laughed at anyone who told me I'd find healing by watching a bull protect orphaned calves," Robert continued. "But here I am, learning about sacrifice and protection from an animal I once saw as nothing more than livestock." As the day progressed toward evening, the immediate crisis had transformed into something else, an opportunity for discovery, for re-evaluation, for seeing the natural world with fresh eyes. The ticking clock that had driven their urgent response had given way to a different kind of time frame, the patient rhythm of research, observation, and growing understanding. In the golden light of late afternoon, Jake watched as warriors stood at the edge of the newly constructed watering access, seemingly inspecting their work. The bull's behavior over the past 24 hours had forced Jake to confront the limitations of his own understanding, to recognize that the inner lives of animals might be far richer, more complex, and more emotionally nuanced than humans had been willing to acknowledge. And in that recognition lay both humility and hope. Humility in the face of how much remained unknown about the creatures with whom humans shared the planet, and hope that such understanding might lead to more compassionate, more sustainable relationships between species. As the sun began to set over the Amazon basin, painting the river in shades of orange and gold, Jake felt privileged to have witnessed something that would change not just his professional perspective, but his personal understanding of what it meant to be a conscious being in a world of other minds, some human, some not, but all worthy of respect and protection. 3 days had passed since the environmental officer's arrival, and the management plan was well underway. The protected watering station stood complete, a carefully engineered structure that allowed cattle safe access to the river while preventing approach from Caiman-accessible areas. The feeding program for the elderly Caiman, now nicknamed Old One by the team, had stabilized its condition, with subtle improvements already visible in its movement and alertness. Jake stood at the edge of Robert's porch, sipping coffee as dawn broke over the Amazon basin. The ranch had transformed into a hub of activity, with researchers from the University of Manaus arriving yesterday to establish formal observation protocols. What had begun as an emergency rescue had evolved into something approaching a field research station. "Morning," Robert said, joining him with his own steaming mug. "Sleep well?" Jake nodded. "Better than I expected." "Any updates from the overnight monitoring?" Robert smiled, the pride evident in his weathered face. "Warrior led the calves to the new watering station just after midnight, used it exactly as designed, kept them in the protected area while they drank, then did a perimeter check before leading them back to pasture. And the Caiman? Accepted its meal from the feeding platform without incident. Melissa thinks its strength is already improving." Jake felt a wave of satisfaction. Despite the complexity of the situation, their solution appeared to be working. Yet beneath that satisfaction lay a deeper current of wonder and unresolved questions that nagged at his professional understanding. "I keep thinking about the implications," Jake admitted. "If a bull can develop this kind of problem-solving behavior, this level of protective response for unrelated calves, makes you wonder what else we've been missing," Robert finished for him. "I've been raising cattle for 10 years, and I never would have believed this if I hadn't seen it myself." The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted their reflection. Melissa climbed the porch steps, tablet in hand, her expression troubled. "We've got a complication," she said without preamble. Jake straightened. "What kind of complication?" The blood work came back from Warrior's samples. She handed Jake the tablet displaying laboratory results. "The puncture wounds are healing well, but there's evidence of significant anemia and muscle wasting. He's been compromising his own health for months to feed the Caiman." Robert's face paled. "How serious?" "If the pattern had continued uninterrupted, potentially fatal within another month or two," Melissa replied. "He's been sacrificing his own tissue and blood regularly, and his body can't sustain that level of depletion." Jake studied the results, the implications sinking in. Warrior's self-sacrifice had been even more profound than they'd initially understood. The bull hadn't just been risking injury, he'd been systematically allowing himself to be bled and wounded to provide nutrition for the Caiman, all to protect the orphaned calves. "He's not just smart," Jake said quietly. "He's literally been willing to die for them." Robert turned away, emotion evident in the set of his shoulders. After a moment he spoke, his voice rough. My Catherine would have done the same, did do the same in her way, worked herself to exhaustion caring for her hospice patients even as her own cancer advanced. He shook his head. Never thought I'd see that kind of sacrifice in an animal. The question now, Melissa said, bringing them back to the immediate concern, is whether our intervention is enough. Warrior needs time to recover his strength, but if he perceives the Caiman as still a threat to the calves, he might try to continue the feeding relationship despite the new systems we've put in place, Jake finished. A heavy silence fell as they contemplated the implications. Their carefully designed management plan might not be sufficient if Warrior's protective instincts overrode the new structures they'd created. Ryan joined them, carrying medical supplies for Warrior's morning treatment. Torres called, he reported. The higher-ups at the Environmental Agency have taken an interest in our case. They're sending a senior official to assess the situation tomorrow. Jake groaned inwardly. More bureaucracy, more explaining, more justification for their unorthodox approach. Did Torres say what they're concerned about specifically? He asked. Ryan shrugged. Apparently, word has spread. This isn't just a local matter anymore. They're calling it a potential paradigm shift in understanding bovine cognition. Great, Jake muttered. More pressure. Melissa's scientific mind was already adapting to the new challenge. Actually, this could work in our favor. More official interest means more resources, more protection for the study. Unless they decide the whole thing is too unpredictable and order a separation, Jake countered. The thought hung in the air, the possibility that environmental authorities might mandate relocating the Caiman and separating Warrior from the calves he had adopted. Standard protocol would certainly suggest such an approach. They can't do that, Robert said, his voice hard with sudden determination. These are my animals on my land. Jake shook his head. The Caiman is a protected species. If they determine the situation presents an ongoing risk, then we need to make sure they don't reach that determination, Melissa interjected. We need to demonstrate that our management plan is working, that both animals are recovering, and that the relationship is stabilizing in a healthier form. Over breakfast, they developed a strategy for the official visit. Melissa would compile all their scientific observations, emphasizing the unprecedented nature of the case and its importance for understanding animal cognition. Ryan would prepare a complete veterinary assessment showing Warrior's improving condition. Jake would ensure the watering station and feeding platform were functioning perfectly, and Robert would do what he did best, tell the story of Warrior and the orphaned calves with the simple eloquence of a man who had witnessed something miraculous on his own land. After finalizing their plans, Jake and Ryan headed to the pasture to check on Warrior. They found the bull resting beneath a spreading tree, the calves grazing nearby. Despite his injuries, Warrior maintained his vigilant watch, dark eyes scanning the surroundings periodically. Look at his positioning, Ryan noted as they approached. He's placed himself between the calves and the river, even though he knows the watering station is secure now. Jake observed the bull's strategic location, another piece of evidence for his remarkable awareness. The protective instinct remained strong even with our interventions. As they drew closer, Warrior rose to his feet, watching them without alarm, but with clear attention. The bull's wounds were healing well, the bandages Ryan had applied yesterday still secure. "Hey, big guy," Ryan said softly, approaching with practiced calm. "Time for your checkup." To their continuing amazement, Warrior stood patiently as Ryan examined his injuries, changed bandages, and administered antibiotics. No restraints were necessary. The bull seemed to understand that they were helping him. "His temperature is normal, pulse strong," Ryan reported. "Physically, he's responding well to treatment." Jake nodded, relieved. But the anemia and muscle wasting Melissa mentioned, how long for recovery? With proper nutrition and no further blood loss. A month, maybe 2, for full recovery. Ryan packed away his medical supplies. The real question is behavioral, not medical. Will he accept our solution? Or will he try to resume his feeding relationship with the Caiman? It was the central question of their entire management plan, whether human intervention could successfully redirect a behavior pattern that had developed organically between two species without human involvement. After completing Warrior's treatment, they made their way to the river to check on the Caiman. The feeding platform they had constructed, essentially a reinforced dock extending into the water, allowed them to place food for the reptile without risk to themselves or the cattle. Old One was visible in the shallows near the platform, its ancient eyes watching their approach with what Jake had come to recognize as calculated interest rather than simple predatory focus. 4 fish yesterday, all consumed, Ryan noted, checking the log they maintained. Melissa wants to increase to 5 today, adding some calcium supplements. Jake nodded his approval, studying the Caiman. Even after just 3 days of proper feeding, the reptile's condition showed subtle improvements. The skin looked less dull, the movements more fluid. "You know what still bothers me?" Jake said as Ryan prepared the day's feeding. "How did this start? What was the first interaction that led to this relationship between Warrior and Old One?" Ryan paused, considering. "You think it was deliberate from the beginning, not just random events that developed into a pattern?" "I'm not sure what I think anymore," Jake admitted. "A month ago, I would have said complex problem-solving and intentional self-sacrifice were beyond a bull's capabilities. Now," he gestured toward the water, "now I'm wondering what else we've been wrong about." As they completed the Caiman's feeding, Melissa called with news that added yet another layer to the unfolding situation. The university team analyzed the footage from Robert's security cameras going back 6 months, she reported, excitement evident in her voice. "They found something you need to see." Back at the ranch house, they gathered around Robert's television as Melissa connected her laptop. The screen displayed grainy night vision footage from the previous rainy season, dated nearly 5 months earlier. "This is from before the orphaned calves appeared," Melissa explained. "Watch the interaction between Warrior and the Caiman." The footage showed Warrior approaching the river alone, moving with the same purposeful stride they had come to recognize. At the water's edge, he paused, then lowered his massive head to drink. Nearby, the distinctive shape of the Caiman appeared, gliding slowly toward the bull. What happened next caused Jake to lean forward in disbelief. Instead of retreating from the approaching predator, Warrior shifted position, presenting his flank. The Caiman approached cautiously, then seemed to brush against the bull's leg without attacking. After this brief contact, both animals separated, each returning to their respective domains. "It wasn't aggressive," Jake murmured. "It was recognition." "There's more," Melissa said. Fast forward 3 weeks. The next clip showed a similar interaction, but with a critical difference. This time, Warrior deliberately regurgitated cud into the water before the Caiman approached. The reptile consumed the offering, then retreated without any physical contact with the bull. "They established this relationship before the calves even appeared," Robert said, his voice hushed with wonder. Warrior was preparing. The implications were staggering. It suggested not just responsive adaptation, but foresight, the ability to establish a non-aggressive relationship with a potential predator before it became necessary for protection. "There's one more clip you need to see," Melissa said, her expression grave as she cued the final video. This footage, dated just 2 months ago, showed Warrior at the river's edge with the Caiman nearby. In the background, barely visible, were the shapes of the orphaned calves, watching from a distance. As they observed, Warrior deliberately turned his hind leg toward the Caiman, which gripped it briefly before releasing, The bull showed no panic, no attempt to flee. He was teaching the calves, Jake said, the realization dawning. Showing them that the Caiman wasn't a threat to them as long as he was there. The room fell silent as they absorbed the implications. Warrior hadn't just developed a strategy for protecting the calves. He had been preparing the groundwork for that protection before the need arose, then demonstrating the arrangement to the calves themselves. It suggested levels of foresight, teaching behavior, and abstract thinking that shattered conventional understanding of bovine cognition. "The paper on this is going to rewrite textbooks," Melissa said softly. Robert stood abruptly, moving to the window that overlooked the pasture where Warrior now grazed peacefully with his adopted family. "He's not a research subject," he said, his voice tight with emotion. He trailed off, unable to find adequate words. Jake understood the rancher's protective instinct. After witnessing Warrior's extraordinary behavior, it was impossible not to see the bull as something more than livestock, as an individual with complexity, agency, and what could only be described as moral choice. "The visiting official arrives tomorrow," Jake said, bringing them back to their immediate concerns. "These findings strengthen our case for maintaining the current management plan rather than separating the animals." Melissa nodded. "I'll incorporate this new evidence into my presentation." As they continued their preparations, a sudden commotion outside drew their attention. Miguel, Robert's ranch hand, was running toward the house, waving his arms urgently. "Mr. Lawson, come quick! The bull, he's heading to the river again." They rushed outside, Robert moving with surprising speed for his age. From the elevated position of the ranch house, they could see Warrior moving deliberately toward the river, his distinctive silver-gray form unmistakable against the green landscape. "The calves are still in the pasture," Ryan observed. "He's going alone." "Damn it," Jake muttered. "If he tries to resume the feeding relationship." They hurried toward the river, Robert calling for a vehicle, but the distance was too great, the bull moving with purpose toward the water's edge. Through binoculars, Jake watched as Warrior reached the river, not at the protected watering station they had built, but at the original location where they had first found him with the Caiman. "What's he doing?" Melissa asked, breathless from their rapid pace. Jake focused the binoculars, trying to understand what was unfolding. "He's at the edge, looking into the water. The Caiman is approaching." "We need to intervene," Ryan insisted. "He's still too weak to lose more blood." But Robert placed a restraining hand on Ryan's arm. "Wait, something's different." Through the binoculars, Jake saw the Caiman surface near Warrior. The bull lowered his head, not in submission, but in what appeared to be acknowledgement. The Caiman remained motionless in the water. Then, in a movement that seemed almost ceremonial, Warrior turned and walked away from the river, heading back toward the calves in the pasture. "He didn't feed it," Jake said, lowering the binoculars in astonishment. "He just checked on it." As they watched, Warrior returned to the orphaned calves, his powerful form moving with the quiet dignity that had become so familiar over the past days. There was no sign of new injury, no indication he had resumed the bloodletting that had nearly cost him his life. "He's accepting the new arrangement," Melissa said, her voice filled with wonder. "He verified that the Caiman was being fed, and now he's returning to his primary responsibility, the calves." The moment held profound significance beyond its immediate implications for their management plan. It suggested that Warrior's behavior wasn't simply instinctive or conditioned, but adaptive, capable of incorporating new information and adjusting strategies accordingly. As they walked back to the ranch house, a sense of cautious optimism replaced their earlier concern. The new evidence of Warrior's cognitive flexibility strengthened their case for the approaching evaluation, offering hope that the authorities would approve their unorthodox approach rather than mandating separation. Yet beneath that practical consideration lay a deeper realization, one that would continue to resonate long after this particular situation was resolved. They had witnessed something that challenged fundamental assumptions about the boundaries between human and animal minds, between instinct and intelligence, between self-preservation and sacrifice. And in that challenge lay both humility and hope. Humility in recognizing how much remained unknown about the inner lives of the creatures with whom humans shared the planet, and hope that such understanding might lead to more compassionate, more sustainable relationships between species. As the day faded toward evening, Jake stood once more on Robert's porch, watching as Warrior guided his adopted family toward shelter for the night. Tomorrow would bring new challenges in the form of official evaluation, but tonight, in the golden light of the Amazon sunset, Jake allowed himself to simply witness the quiet dignity of an animal whose actions had expanded the horizons of what humans believed possible. 10 years had passed since the remarkable events at the Lawson Ranch, and the legacy of what became known as the Warrior Study had transformed understanding of animal cognition across multiple scientific disciplines. Jake Thornton, now the Regional Director of Wildlife Management for the entire Amazon basin, stood once more on Robert's porch, watching the sunrise paint the landscape in hues of gold and amber. "Still takes my breath away," Robert said, joining him with 2 steaming mugs of coffee. At 75, the former Boston banker moved more slowly now, his once upright frame slightly stooped, but his blue eyes remained sharp beneath a shock of white hair. "Some things never change," Jake agreed, accepting the offered coffee. "How's our old friend doing?" Robert smiled, the deep lines around his eyes crinkling with affection. "Warrior? 17 years old now, ancient for a bull, moving slower, just like me," but still watching over his family. They stood in companionable silence, sipping their coffee as the day brightened. So much had changed in the decade since that fateful morning when Jake had responded to an emergency call about a bull caught in the jaws of a caiman. What had begun as a rescue operation had evolved into one of the most significant animal behavior studies in recent history. "The film crew arrives this afternoon," Robert said. "National Geographic, their 3rd documentary about Warrior." Jake nodded. "Hard to believe how far this has spread. When I was filing those first reports, trying to convince my supervisors not to separate the animals, I never imagined we'd end up rewriting textbooks." "Catherine would have loved it all," Robert said softly, gazing toward the pasture where the massive silver-gray form of Warrior could be seen in the distance. "She always said animals had more going on in their heads than we gave them credit for." After the initial crisis had passed and the official evaluation had approved their management approach, Melissa had established a formal research program to document the extraordinary relationship between Warrior, the caiman they now called Old One, and the orphaned calves. What began as a local curiosity had quickly attracted international scientific attention. The University of Sao Paulo had established a permanent field station on a portion of Robert's land. Graduate students rotated through regularly, conducting careful observations and controlled studies that expanded understanding of bovine cognition and behavior. Warrior, for his part, had seemed to accept the human attention with the same dignified tolerance he showed toward all aspects of his unusual life. "Let's head down to the observation area," Robert suggested. "The morning check-in should be starting." They walked together down the well-worn path that connected the ranch house to what had become known as Warrior's Pasture, a specially designated area where the bull and his adopted family were free to roam while being monitored by unobtrusive cameras and occasional direct observation. At the simple wooden structure that served as the field station, they found Dr. Eliza Johnson, the current lead researcher, reviewing overnight footage with 2 graduate students. "Morning, gentlemen," she greeted them, her British accent crisp in the humid air. "Perfect timing. We've just observed something rather remarkable in the dawn footage." On the monitor, they could see Warrior leading a small group of cattle, no longer calves but adult cows, toward the protected watering station that had been expanded and improved over the years. What caught Jake's attention was the presence of a younger bull, perhaps 3 or 4 years old, walking alongside Warrior. "That's Thunder," Robert explained. "One of the original orphaned calves Warrior adopted, grew into quite a fine bull himself." "Watch their interaction," Dr. Johnson instructed, pointing to the screen. As the group approached the watering station, Warrior stopped, turning his massive head toward Thunder. The younger bull moved forward, taking the lead position as the group entered the protected area. Warrior remained at the perimeter, standing sentinel as the others drank. "He's teaching Thunder to take over the protective role," Dr. Johnson said, her voice hushed with excitement. "We've observed increasing instances of this behavior over the past month. It appears Warrior is preparing for succession." Jake felt a tightness in his throat. After a decade of observing Warrior's extraordinary behavior, he should have been beyond surprise, yet the bull's capacity for foresight and planning continued to humble him. "What about Old One?" he asked. "Any recent interactions?" The Caiman, now estimated to be over 30 years old, had remained in its territory near the river. The feeding program established during the crisis had evolved into a more natural management approach, with the protected watering station designed to maintain separation while allowing both species to thrive in their shared environment. "Fascinating development there as well," Dr. Johnson replied, switching to a different camera feed. "Old One appears to be establishing a similar relationship with a younger Caiman that moved into the territory last wet season." The footage showed the elderly Caiman sharing a fish with a smaller, younger specimen, behavior virtually unknown in normally territorial reptiles. "It's as if the cooperative model Warrior established is spreading," Dr. Johnson continued. "We're observing behavioral transmission, not just within species, but potentially across species as well." Robert shook his head in wonder. "And to think the environmental folks initially wanted to separate them all." Jake remembered those tense early meetings with the authorities, the skepticism they'd faced, the bureaucratic hurdles they'd overcome. The senior official who had arrived for that crucial evaluation had initially been dismissive, citing regulations and standard protocols that would have mandated relocating the Caiman and restricting the cattle's access to the river entirely. What had changed his mind was witnessing Warrior's behavior firsthand, seeing the bull check on the Caiman without resuming the dangerous feeding relationship, then return to the calves with clear purpose. In that moment, rigid adherence to protocol had given way to recognition of something extraordinary that deserved protection rather than disruption. "How's the book coming along?" Jake asked Robert as they walked toward the pasture after leaving the research station. Robert chuckled. "Editor says I need to cut about 50 pages. Apparently I get too philosophical about what Warrior taught me." After years of encouragement from Jake and Melissa, Robert had finally agreed to write a memoir about his experiences. Not just about Warrior and the Caiman, but about his journey from Boston banker to Amazon rancher and the lessons in compassion and connection he'd learned along the way. "Don't cut a word," Jake advised. "Some stories can't be contained in neat packages." As they approached the fence line, they spotted Warrior grazing peacefully about 100 yards away. Despite his advanced age, the bull maintained an impressive presence, his silver-gray coat now laced with white, his massive frame still powerful though somewhat leaner than in his prime. Robert whistled softly, a distinctive three-note call he had used for years. Warrior raised his head, dark eyes finding them immediately. After a moment's consideration, the bull began walking toward them with unhurried dignity. "Still amazes me every time," Jake said quietly. 17 years together builds a connection," Robert replied. "Sometimes I think he understands more of what I'm saying than most people do." Warrior stopped a few yards from the fence, regarding them with what Jake had come to recognize as genuine recognition. The bull's eyes, deep and knowing, seemed to hold awareness that went beyond simple animal intelligence. "Morning, old friend," Robert said, his voice softening as it always did when addressing Warrior. "Got some visitors coming to see you today." "More cameras and people making a fuss. You just keep being yourself, you hear?" Warrior lowered his massive head slightly, as if acknowledging the information, then raised it again to survey the pasture where Thunder was leading the others toward a fresh grazing area. "He's proud of them," Robert said, not as a question but as a simple statement of fact. Raised those orphans himself, and now they're taking care of each other. Jake nodded, understanding the emotion in the older man's voice. "Some kinds of family aren't about blood." "Ain't that the truth?" Robert agreed. "When Catherine died, I thought I'd never have family again. Came down here to be alone with my grief." He gestured toward Warrior and the cattle beyond. "Instead, I found another kind of connection. Different, but just as real." They stood in silence for a while, watching as Warrior eventually turned and walked back toward his herd, his movements deliberate and purposeful despite his age. "You know what still gets me?" Jake said. "Even after all the research, all the papers and studies, we still don't really know why he did it. Why this particular bull chose to protect orphaned calves and establish a relationship with a natural predator." Robert considered this. "Science can tell us how, but it can't always tell us why, I reckon. Maybe some things aren't meant to be fully understood, just witnessed and respected." As they walked back toward the ranch house, Jake reflected on how the events of a decade ago had transformed not just his professional understanding of animal behavior, but his personal perspective on consciousness and connection. Before Warrior, he had seen his role as a ranger primarily in terms of managing conflicts between species, protecting humans from wildlife and wildlife from humans. Now he understood his work as something more nuanced, facilitating coexistence, recognizing intelligence and agency across species boundaries, and approaching the natural world with humility rather than presumption. The National Geographic crew arrived that afternoon, setting up equipment with the practiced efficiency of professionals who had filmed wildlife around the world. The lead producer, a woman named Sarah Chen, had spent weeks corresponding with Dr. Johnson about the specific protocols for filming without disturbing the animals. "We want to capture the teaching behavior between Warrior and Thunder if possible," she explained during the briefing. "And of course, any interaction with Old One would be extraordinary footage." Robert, who had grown comfortable with media attention over the years, explained the boundaries he still maintained. "Filming is fine, but no disruption of their routines. And Warrior isn't a performer. He does what he does in his own time." The crew respected these guidelines, setting up remote cameras and blind hides that would allow observation without interference. By sunset, they were ready for the next day's filming, and Robert invited everyone to dinner at the ranch house. As they gathered around the long wooden table that had hosted countless researchers and visitors over the past decade, conversation flowed easily between the film crew, the scientific team, and those like Jake and Robert who had been present from the beginning. "What I still find most remarkable," Dr. Johnson said during a lull in the conversation, "is not just Warrior's behavior, but how it's influenced our understanding across disciplines. We've had evolutionary biologists, ethicists, cognitive scientists, even philosophers visiting the station." Sarah Chen nodded enthusiastically. "That's what drew us back for a third documentary. The first was about the discovery, the second about the scientific findings, but this one is about the larger impact, how one bull's behavior has changed how we think about consciousness itself. My Catherine would say we're finally catching up to what she always knew," Robert said with a soft chuckle. She used to talk to our houseplants back in Boston, swore they grew better when you showed them respect. As dinner concluded and the visitors returned to their accommodations, Jake remained behind, helping Robert clear the table in the comfortable routine they had established during his frequent visits over the years. "Hard to believe it's been 10 years, Jake said, carefully wrapping leftover cornbread. "Feels like yesterday sometimes." Robert nodded, rinsing plates with hands that showed the slight tremor of advancing age. "Time's a funny thing. Some days drag on forever, but years slip by in a blink." He paused, gazing out the kitchen window toward the darkened pasture. "Warrior won't be with us many more years. Bulls his age are rare." Jake felt the familiar pang that came with such acknowledgments. Warrior had become more than a research subject. He was the center of a community, a teacher, a testament to possibilities previously unimagined. "His legacy is secure," Jake said, "not just in the research, but in what he's taught Thunder, in how he's changed this place." "And in how he changed us," Robert added quietly. "That's the part that matters most, I reckon." The next morning dawned clear and bright, perfect conditions for filming. The crew set up before sunrise, cameras positioned to capture the cattle's morning routines without intrusion. Jake joined Robert on his usual morning walk to check on Warrior, both men moving quietly to avoid disturbing the filming in progress. As they approached the pasture, they noticed something unusual. Warrior was leading the entire group, including Thunder, toward the river. "This is different," Robert murmured. "He hasn't taken the lead position in weeks." They watched from a distance as the procession reached the protected watering station. Warrior paused, then continued past it, heading instead toward the original location where they had first found him with the Caiman 10 years earlier. "Should we alert the crew?" Jake asked, concerned about missing the opportunity to document whatever was unfolding. Robert shook his head. "They've got remote cameras all along the river. Let's just watch." As Warrior reached the river's edge, Old One emerged from the water, its ancient form moving with surprising grace for a reptile of its advanced age. The younger Caiman appeared nearby, watching attentively. What followed was something Jake could only describe as a ceremony. Warrior stood at the edge of the water, Thunder beside him. Old One approached slowly, the younger Caiman following. For a long moment, predator and prey regarded each other across the narrow boundary between land and water. Then, with deliberate movements, Warrior lowered his head, not in submission but in acknowledgement. Old One responded by submerging briefly, then resurfacing, as if returning the gesture. No food was exchanged, no physical contact made. It was, Jake realized, a demonstration. Warrior showing Thunder and the younger Caiman the relationship that had sustained their unusual community for a decade. After the brief interaction, Warrior turned, leading the group back toward the protected watering station where they finally drank. Thunder took up his position as guard, exactly as he had been taught. "Well, I'll be," Robert whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "He's making sure it continues after he's gone." Jake nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. What they had just witnessed transcended scientific categorization. It was culture being transmitted, not human culture, but something equally valid, equally profound. A tradition of cooperation rather than conflict, of protection rather than predation. Later that day, when the film crew reviewed the footage from the remote cameras and realized what they had captured, there was a stunned silence in the research station. "This is unprecedented," Sarah Chen finally said. "This changes everything about how we frame the documentary." Dr. Johnson was already making notes, her scientific training wrestling with the profound implications of what they had observed. "It suggests not just teaching behavior, but abstract understanding of relationship continuity across generations. The cognitive requirements for such foresight are extraordinary." For Jake, watching the footage played back on the monitor, The technical analysis felt somehow secondary to the simple emotional truth of what they had witnessed. Warrior, approaching the end of his remarkable life, was ensuring that what he had built would continue, that the orphans he had protected would remain safe, that the relationship he had established would persist. As the day progressed into evening, Jake found himself drawn back to the pasture. Robert joined him without a word, both men understanding the need to process what they had witnessed. Warrior stood beneath his favorite tree, separated slightly from the herd, his massive form silhouetted against the setting sun. As they watched, Thunder approached the older bull, the two animals standing side by side in what could only be described as companionable silence. "You know," Robert said after a while, "when I first called you folks that morning, all those years ago, I was just trying to save my prize bull from a Caiman. Never imagined we'd end up here." Jake smiled. "Life takes some unexpected turns." "That it does." Robert's weathered face softened with reflection. "Catherine used to say that love isn't just a human thing, it's woven into the fabric of creation itself. Shows up in the darndest places if you've got eyes to see it." As the golden light of evening gave way to the purple hues of dusk, Jake considered Robert's words. Perhaps that was the ultimate legacy of what they had witnessed over the past decade. Not just a reevaluation of animal cognition or interspecies relationships, but a broader recognition of connections that transcended conventional boundaries. A bull had chosen to protect orphaned calves not his own. A predator and prey had established a relationship beyond aggression, and humans had set aside preconceptions to witness, learn, and ultimately protect something they didn't fully understand but recognized as valuable. "Some things don't need explaining," Robert said, seeming to read Jake's thoughts. "They just need respecting." As darkness settled over the Amazon basin, the stars emerging in brilliant clarity above the canopy, Jake found himself filled with a profound sense of gratitude for being present at the beginning of this extraordinary story, for witnessing its unfolding over a decade, and for the privilege of seeing traditional boundaries between species, between instinct and intelligence, between human and animal, dissolve in the face of something more fundamental and more universal. Warrior had taught them all that the capacity for selflessness, for protection, for adaptation and cooperation wasn't limited to humans. It existed wherever there was life, wherever there was the opportunity for connection. And in that teaching lay both humility and hope. Humility in recognizing how much remained unknown about the inner lives of other beings, and hope that such understanding might lead to a world where humans approach the natural world not as separate from it, but as part of a larger community of minds, each with its own form of wisdom, its own kind of soul. In the decade since, rangers discovered a bull protecting orphaned calves by feeding a Caiman. Warrior's story has touched countless hearts. At 75, rancher Robert Lawson reflects on his journey from grief-stricken widower to witness of extraordinary compassion. "When Catherine died, I thought I'd never have family again," he shares, watching his 17-year-old bull teaching a younger generation. "Instead, I found another kind of connection." Warrior's selfless protection of calves not his own reminds us that love transcends boundaries. Between species, between blood relations, between what we understand and what we witness with humble hearts. As seniors navigating our golden years, often facing loss and reinvention, Warrior's example offers profound comfort. Family can be found in unexpected places, purpose can emerge from pain, and our capacity to care for others never diminishes with age. His legacy continues as he ensures those he protected will carry forward his lessons of cooperation over conflict. What unexpected connections have brought meaning to your life after loss? Has an animal's devotion ever taught you something about love that changed your perspective? Please please share your stories in the comments. Sometimes our greatest teachers have four legs and silent wisdom.